So let it be written. So let it be done. This is Tabletop Terrors, and we're going to talk about what kind of failure in a game is fun and interesting, and what kind makes you want to punch your own face. So I want to tell you about a monk in one of my first campaigns ever. James knows this story. This was the monk Alel. He was an elven monk, and he was the pinnacle of grace. So we're playing, and I mean, I just learned how to DM, and that's even going too far. He wants to find out something in a library. So he's like, all right, cool. What do you do for it? Well, I'm a DM, of course. What do you do for it? You roll for it, baby. That's what I say. That's what we do. We roll here. And, okay, I want to find this interesting information about my, elven, blah, blah, blah. Okay, cool. Roll. What do you think he rolled? First roll. What do you think? It was a 1, Jeff. It was a 1. And we all know if you pick up one thing sort of by osmosis, it's that the 1 is bad and it's critical, and that means that everything goes wrong. So here's what I do. Instead of having him maybe not find anything or learn the wrong information, I feel like this is the opportunity to tell him that when he goes to pull the book out of the shelf begins to wobble, and then like one shelf falls down and he trips. Now this is the monk, mind you. The monk trips and he falls and he knocks this, and I essentially make it so that narratively the entire library fell down. Because the monk tripped, because he rolled a 1 looking for information. That, to me, well, I know for him, it's a funny story now. And he's actually going to be in my home group that we're starting. So we jokingly, I was like, Alel, is that you? So in my opinion, though, that is a good example of when failure. Not only did I call for the wrong kind of roll, and I think there are a lot of layers to why I should have handled that differently. Watch the short form quick tips on how to handle that correctly. But I don't think that was the kind of thing where failure was fun, and I could have made it fun. I could have made it interesting. I could have made it narrative. And instead, I sort of went the antithesis of what the monk is, and I have always regretted it, but then I'm glad there's a cool story in there. So what about you, Jeff? Tell me, like, what's fun for you in a game when you, like, why do we like to fail, and what's fun in failing?
Yeah, so there's definitely a very clear line for me between, like, what we would call, like, fun failure versus, like, frustrating failure. I think for me, it kind of boils down to one sort of big thing. Does it add to the drama of the story, or does it take away from the drama of the story? And that's kind of, at least for me, all there is to it. Now, there's obviously a lot of detail and context that you can start to dive into that. But I'll kind of break it down as, like, with 2 big examples of, like, what I think a good failure is and what I find to be a frustrating failure in a game. So the frustrating failure is one where you try to do something and just nothing happens. Like, you fail the roll and the game stops. So one example that I think, unfortunately, is basically impossible to get away from in a game unless you totally change the system is, like, I'm in a combat, I'm a wizard or a cleric, I've taken all my cool spells, I'm looking through my spell list, there's the one big bad guy left. Ooh, I see I still have a 2nd level spell slot. Hold person, that would be pretty cool if I could, cast that. I move my hands, I do this incantation, these spectral chains start to whip up from the ground, wrapping around the big bad guy's arms and legs, gonna hold him down so my party can take him out. He needs to make a saving throw. He passes the saving throw. Nothing happens, I guess. My turn's done.
Is
like, it's
else?
Just, yeah.
Is there anything else you want to do in your turn, Jeff?
Do you want to use your movement? Do you have a bonus action? Like, it's just like, I know that there's not really a way to get around that with the way that 5e is set up, at least, but it's just like, it's so frustrating when you build up this really cool idea that you have for how something is going to go and how something is going to look, and then you try to do it, and it just dead stop, shut down, like no way to continue. It's one of the most. I maintain to this day that specific feeling of casting a spell, especially a high level spell, and having the enemy just succeed flat out and nothing happens. Like, to me, that is probably the most frustrating game experience in terms of mechanics in 5e that I can feel. It's so aggravating to, like, because you're building up to this climactic, dramatic display, and then it gets shut down. So it's sort of like an anticlimax in a way, where you've built up something really cool. You're trying to have an awesome moment that's going to be the memorable moment, that you'll be talking about 3 sessions later of, oh, you remember when he did the whole person, then I came in and got the critical hit because he was paralyzed, and we had this cool effect. And that story is basically robbed from the table just because the guy, you failed to have the spell go right. Contrast that with what I think can be really fun failure is when that failure actually adds drama to the situation. So one sort of easy, obvious example is, you have like really rocky terrain and you need to like leap over a chasm. So if everybody just succeeds, that's fine. You make your running jump, everybody makes it, the story continues. That's fine. That's totally nothing wrong with that. But it can be a really exciting moment if one of the people goes to make the jump and their foot slips on the rock and now they're falling, but they manage to catch the edge. And then the rest of the party kind of has to think on their feet of like, oh, I have rope. Like, let me tie it to him so we can pull him up. If you just make sure he doesn't fall, you use this magic spell you have. So it kind of becomes an activity in itself to work through the failure of that roll, which I think can be a lot of fun. And basically rolls that have consequences that are interesting can be really exciting to fail. You're trying to sneak into this place and you fail and the guard sees you. What do? Can you get to him before he screams? Is he going to alert everybody? Is the operation going to be done? Like, how do you recover from that? That's it. It gets people thinking, it gets people moving, it gets people acting, and it brings excitement to the game. And now everyone's tense. Oh, are we going to make it? Can we get to him in time? It's really exciting. So I think it's really important in the situations where you can control. So you can't fix the spell save thing unless you completely rework magic in D&D. But you can sort of take that idea to other roles and say, if you're going to have that acrobatics check, if they fail it, is it going to stop the game from happening, or is it going to cause excitement to happen? And I think if you start to sort of think in those terms, it can really help you decide when and how you're going to make those rolls happen. And sometimes it's just unavoidable. Like, you need to have a certain thing and then it fails and it kind of messes things up. But I think a lot of times you can make sure that you build it into situations where it continues the excitement up. That can typically done by having the failure lead to an exciting encounter that might be bypassed with success, but you get to play out with a failure, rather than having the failure stop progress and shut the game down and sort of stall everything out.
And Tim actually mentioned something that really goes along with that in our short form, especially with like plot information and stuff. There are a lot of ways that it can be very dangerous, to the game, where you say stop, where it like seems like it's not that interesting. In some cases, like the combat, you're like, well, it definitely stopped it for that person, but okay, you're going to continue and somebody's eventually going to kill this guy. All right. But in some cases, it can literally stop the game, and you have your players sitting around, looking at you like, okay, so now what, and I think it's that for me, I often do try to say, okay, well, if they do fail, if I'm going to ask for a roll, if they do fail, what happens? And just consider, okay, is that fun? Are they just going to die outright? Is it going to entirely derail? The other thing is, and it's one of my favorite things to explore with rolling, is we call it failure, and that's failure to meet the number, not failure at the thing. And sounds like maybe a weird distinction, but the idea that failing to hit the roll doesn't mean you failed to do the thing. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. The important thing is that it's always so binary that you failed or you succeeded. It's harder to ask for rolls for things. Another good example is if they have to pick a lock. They're going to pick the lock, or most likely, certainly if there's not a crazy time pressure. And if that's the case, make sure that something happens if they fail, not just keep trying over again. But, and I touched on this very briefly in the short form, it doesn't necessarily have to directly tie to the lock. Maybe, somebody else is fiddling around and they do the thing from Indiana Jones where they step on the thing that starts the room to start crushing them. It's like, well, the rogue was tinkering around and there was failure on the die. So now what happens as a result of that? And for me, exploring what other things can happen as a result of somebody not hitting a specific check has given me so many more options to make sure that one or two failures doesn't basically derail the entire game and makes me have to go, oh, sorry, guys, they were supposed to give you this. We can keep going now.
Yeah. And I think as you said it just then, I kind of started thinking of like, well, what would it look like if we truly think of dice rolls as fortune and good fortune and bad fortune, like you're saying. So like if they do miss the roll, as you're suggesting, that is interesting. And I have heard that where it's that failing forward mechanic sort of where it's like, we use, I'll just to change it up, we'll use intimidation. So that's something that I think players try to do sometimes is I want to know the information. So I'm going to try to intimidate this, captured bandit, whatever. And so the roll, and let's say you have a DC of something, some 13 or 14. This person's kind of worth their salt. They're not easy to scare, but they're also self-serving. So, it's middling DC, right? Player misses it by 2. What I might do in turn is just kind of talk about what you're saying is like, it's a turn of bad fortune. It doesn't necessarily mean. So I would say, they're very intimidated. They give you the information you want. And as they do so, they use it as an opportunity to let out a whistle showing where they are to the other bandits. And so, like you say, the story progresses. They get the information that they need, but saying, okay, cool, and then something bad happens, as simple as it sounds, I'm really going to try to start doing that. And then I started thinking, and I don't have any hard rules for this because I'm making them up as we speak, but I'm thinking if it's within a couple is probably when I would do that. Close enough so that rolls still matter and not like, Tim just lets me roll and stuff happens. He just makes bad stuff happen too. But like if they're within a couple, so like Jeff, as an example with your spell, I would even consider doing that with combat specifically for magic. Because of that, it's not something I would roll out everywhere, but as a pain point, that matters to me. If that's such a bad thing that it's your worst experience at the table, I would house rule that if your spells are within 2 of the DC, figure it out. Something, but then at a cost. Or maybe I'd make you take a level of exhaustion if you wanted. So, or roll a hit, one of your own hit dice worth of damage of like you push extra hard, but you get a Stranger Things nosebleed. Like, because then you have the option to mitigate what you consider more fun. And so anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there. It's like, I never thought of it that way, James, but I really think I might start really implementing the intent of what is going to happen might still happen if you're close, but then figuring out bad stuff to happen with it.
Yeah. And even specifically to put a point on that, something I didn't say, but wish that I had. I often like to make sure that if somebody does something they should be good at, they succeed at that. Like if somebody tries to intimidate, they didn't look stupid. They just didn't hit the right thing with that person. You know what I mean? I just try to phrase it so that it's not them going, oh, well, you were terrible at that. It's, hey, you did a really good job, but he apparently, is a sociopath, so he doesn't care for his family. So your threat to his family didn't matter. Something like that, where it's like, no, you did fine, but it didn't work in this situation.
Sure.
Yeah, I think you bring up a really good point. And that's actually something I was going to touch on. So I good segue into something that I was already thinking about of like, failure doesn't always have to mean that the person doing the thing did it poorly. There could be so many circumstances as to why something doesn't quite go according to plan. So in that situation, it could be that like you try to intimidate their family and you're threatening and it looks great, but he knows that his family was already migrated out of the city 2 days ago and they're not there for you to get to them. So it's not like you try to threaten him and you slip on the ground and you fall and you look like a doofus. It's like, that doesn't always have to, it doesn't have to be because you did something wrong. It could just be because, there's so many factors in the world. So you try to persuade the king to help give you supplies, and you roll a persuasion check to see if you do it. But it's not if you fail, you roll a 3, It doesn't necessarily mean that you stumbled over your words and you couldn't find a good argument and you looked dumb. It could be that the king secretly already made a trade deal with your enemy, and there's nothing you could say in a million years that could convince him, and that's why you failed. So failure is always sort of a way to add context to the world in these sorts of ways, in a way that I think is not always obvious. Of you might not know beforehand that the king had a trade deal with the enemy, and then the player gives this amazing speech and rolls a 2 on their persuasion. It's like, well, how do you make sense of that? Here's how you make sense of that. He already betrayed the group and has this opposing deal in place, and that's why you failed. So yeah, I do think it's important that, especially if a character has made their person to do a certain thing, I'm the guy who does the crazy acrobatics. That's my thing. That you try to leap from this building and you make a perfect landing, but that part of the building is unstable and it breaks from underneath you. It's not your fault that you messed up, but you still fail. I think that sort of thing can be really important to just sort of easing the blow. Can already be frustrating to try to accomplish something and have it not work as a player, depending on the player. Some people love just to completely, the masochistic player, is a real thing in D&D. But there is a huge difference still between my person is, a master thief, trying to pick the lock. It's actually because the lock is magically constructed to defy reality. So you can't pick it because it's not a physical object that you can even manipulate. It's not because you suddenly become stupid for 10 seconds and you can't do something that you could always do a million times before.
Yeah. Also, we need to make that a magic item. That's super dope. Someone make a note of that. So just thinking of I'm just trying to think of why do I even like this so much? What is it about it? And I think sometimes getting to the core of well, why do we do the thing? And it's for me, I think it's because it's one thing if we're going to sit around and tell a story and we're going to write a story. And I think we've all done plenty of that. And then you choose what is best. But the thrill of the world being random enough that you don't know what's going to happen is, this is going to get probably deeper than we anticipated, but I think a big part of the human condition is wanting to know the answer. I think that's why mysteries are so strong. And I think what we do when we roll this thing is we inject mystery purposefully in these little dopamine hits of oh yeah. And if that dopamine hit is injected in the wrong place, it's no longer a mystery and I'm no longer intrigued to see what the answer is. It's actually that answer doesn't make sense to me. And that's a worse feeling, I think. So does that track to you guys?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's and I think that feeling is amplified the more that there is on the line, the more that chance will greatly affect something, the more that anticipation and that tension and then that rush, I think, hits. So, for example, figuring out if you're going to unlock the door or not, if you're just trying to get into the building, it might be oh, am I going to do it? Am I not? Oh, I did it. Cool. But if you're at 3 hit points with the archer up on the ledge, the arrow pulled back, you need to get through this door right now or you're going to die. And the only way to get through it is to succeed on this roll right now or else he's going to hit you. That's when that chance, I think, makes us get that rush even more so. Is there's stakes to this. It'll change the story dramatically, whether or not I succeed in this. And there's a lot writing on this dumb little piece of plastic that could do whatever it wants to. And I think that, so there's definitely something to say for that mystery. And that's why when I think rolling is most powerful is when you have the most dramatic result of discovering that mystery, which I think kind of ties into like when and how to roll for these things. Is like, what mystery is the dice answering? You know, how important is it to know? You know, when you know the answer, what is it going to do? The more that's heightened, I think the more satisfying it is, both to succeed and to fail. Because if you fail on that roll when it's super dramatic, you know, at the very least, even if your character dies or whatever, it'll at least be a dramatic event that's happening. And I think that's, for me, always the way that I think of the dice is in terms of drama. You know, the more that you can heighten the drama and make either side of the dice roll really powerful, like that's when it becomes the most compelling to me to see that roll happen.
Yeah, the important thing, it's interesting because if you watch a movie or a film, which I often liken, role-playing games to that because it's a story and it's told that way. The idea is when I watch a show, the interesting part is that I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, that's effectively why I'm showing up. In some cases, it's because I want to know the jokes. You know what I mean? If it's a comedy, but still, I'm like, well, I don't know what jokes they're going to tell. It's sort of the mystery of. So the important thing about that is, for me, the idea of the dice, it's the ability to decide exactly what's going to happen, except for when I don't. So I do like to follow those things. I love that, like you said, that very dramatic scene, Jeff, where you might die. I like knowing that I didn't decide whether or not I died. I'm not actually, in a lot of cases, especially in good games when it was done fairly, I'm not sad that I died, especially in a game where sometimes that's not the end. But that is the important part to me, is that's what I like. That's the movie part. That's the, I'm letting chance take over. And of course, you get modifiers and other things that help. But that is the reason I like for it to not be, like you said, you did a poor job of your thing, especially because that isn't interesting, And again, in movies and television, it's not that. I love that example of the building being unstable, because I just think of any action movie where I'm like, well, where does the struggle come in? It's not because the action hero tripped. It's because he had to run across town and the building was unstable. And then it's like, well, he gets back up and he keeps going, but now he just barely missed it because his girlfriend's captured. And you're like, it was the fall that made that happen, And without the dice, it would be difficult for me to say, and then I fall. It's like bringing up those masochistic people. It's funny, Tim covered his face because he's kind of somewhat known for doing things like that. It's actually interesting because to me, that's saying that Tim is like, no, let that thing happen to me. I've seen it in cases where the GM maybe could have said, and you take damage for that. And maybe they were, I don't know, not too timid, but like, oh, maybe that's unfair or something. And sometimes it's like, no, that's the fun part, is what are my scars? You know what I mean? If you get entirely through unscathed, you're like, well, I mean, that was cool, but when's it going to get fun?
Yeah. That's so, okay. All right. So let's take it in this direction. And if you guys have anything you want to say before this, because it's a bit of a shift, I think that it merits a discussion on, especially like Jeff, you're talking about that spell save, that whole thing you described and the chains and all that, right? So think about that. Then you talked about that one roll that literally means life or death to get through the door and the guards are rushing in. I think it's worth talking about fudging dice rolls. And like, okay, so at what point, if at all, do you fudge a dice roll? Meaning, as a game master, because as a player, I mean, that's cheating. Rules is written. You're not allowed to do it. But as a game master, I know what the DC is. And if I know you're one away, and I know that moment is there, and I know there's a lot of different schools of thought, so I want to throw it to you guys. Would you feel better, and what you said, Jeff, was it is the thing you hate the most, or one of, on like a short list. Would you feel better if you never knew? If I just let you have it and I let that moment roll, would you rather that I let you fail like you said? Or would you rather that I fudge the roll as the game master and let it happen even if you never knew about it?
So for me personally, I enjoy the game in equal parts to the story. So there would be a part of me that would feel robbed by the fact that I was playing a rigged game. And I know that not everybody feels that way, and I'm not trying to make a statement about how the game must be played by everybody. But for me personally, I would rather take that moment on the chin, even if it sucks, um, because that's the game, and I want to play the game. So for me, there is definitely a line where the frustration of the game is part of the experience in a way. And if you're maximizing that frustration unduly, that's a bad thing. And I'll definitely be the first person to say that. And but I'd still at the end of the day would rather know that when I do win, that victory was a thing that we earned by nature of playing the game well. So I'm not a fan of fudging dice rolls. In fact, the few times as a GM when I do fudge the dice, it's usually against the players. In the sense of this is the way that I usually do it. Actually, if I have a big bad villain who's just getting wrecked by his own dice, that's my biggest temptation to fudge as a GM. Is I have a villain who rolls to hit and he just keeps rolling twos on his hit rolls, and it's going to make this final fight against the villain a cakewalk because he just keeps missing and can't do anything to the party. So that's honestly, as a full confession time, that's my biggest temptation as a GM to fudge, is to make it harder or at least more dramatic for the players to fight, because I don't want that anticlimactic scenario. So yeah, I definitely get the temptation to fudge that save, but I think I'd probably rather just try to work it to make it a cool description at the very least of so you cast the spell and it's not just instead of just saying he succeeds, nothing happens, to find some way to make at least the description of the failure interesting and exciting of all these chains are wrapping around him and this burst of magic comes out and he just starts tearing and he breaks the chain, the spectral chain in half. He pulls it apart and it gives out this just primal roar and yells that you can't contain it, whatever it is, I would rather have that happen than just to get it for free. But again, this because the game part matters to me and it doesn't matter as much to everybody. But for me, I'd rather have that, the cool description of you almost had me, but I will not be contained by your magic, whatever you do. So you can make it, even if it's still going to be frustrating, you can make it at least cool.
Yeah.
And that's the way that I would rather have it go.
What about you, James?
Yeah.
You a fudgy boy? Are you a little fudgy boy?
So for me, I think at the risk, well, I won't go down this rabbit hole, but I will point to this rabbit hole of, I personally feel that it's very different because it was combat. So I am very much with Jeff in the sense that I don't like the idea. I feel like a lot of the game would be undermined if I knew that something was fudged. Like in that case where somebody fudged something to make me feel better because I missed. Because then it becomes, well, why don't my spells just hit all the time? Right? It was just the GM happened to feel. And I know that was just an example you picked. So I'm not necessarily trying to dunk on your example. What I will say is I fudge rolls all the time. And I make this bold statement that I do it when I decided what was going to happen already. And for some reason I roll. This doesn't happen, almost never happens as a result of combat or a skill check. But if I go, you know what, I'm going to roll to see which player this hits. And I roll and I go, I don't know why I did that. I want it to happen to that person. It was almost like I wanted to give myself an out. So I rolled the D6 or a D4 to pick one of the people. But instead I go, no, it's way cooler if it hits them. So I tend to over-roll for things. So I will fudge a lot more than I think anybody would be comfortable with. But it's almost exclusively outside the rules. Occasionally I'll fudge something if the same thing happens. Like I do call for a check that didn't need a check or something. Where I realize I've messed up. I won't say, actually don't roll that. I'm going to give it to you because I feel like it's better to just pretend they succeeded. So I will absolutely, it's basically a Band-Aid for me as GMing, but especially in terms of rules and mechanics, I don't really agree with it because I am kind of a rules purist in that sense.
Yeah. And I feel so to be clear, I used to fudge rolls all the time. Like because I feel like I have a good sense as a storyteller. And so the moments we've described, I feel like I can ride that and kind of throttle it and choke it enough to where it's like, okay, there's definitely real danger. People can really die, but I would rather the guards catch up and have a chance to kill you than you botch, as you say, the roll. Now, the stuff that we've talked about in these videos is helping me with a tool set to do all of that more interestingly in terms of how I decode that. So I used to do it all the time. Now I don't ever do it. And it's really difficult because it goes against my full nature as a storyteller. And so, but I think it's important to talk about because the reason why I stopped doing it is I actually was talking to Lloyd Collins, the Jarl DM, and it's what you guys have stated here, which is if it becomes a matter of cheapening the win, at what point do I draw the line where Tim is just telling a story? And that's like, oh yeah, no, you hit. Pff. Why? Because I want it to happen. And that is fine. And Jeff, you made a distinction too. For some tables, they're like, just run me through a good story. Just make it. And if you do fudge, just try not to let me know about it. So, but I started to learn that if that part of the game stinks, it stinks together and we're all bummed about it. And we're still commiserating and it's like, oh, okay. I will also warn you that on a long enough timeline, you will get caught. Because you're going to have a savvy player or someone's going to catch it or you'll forget that you fudged it and then you'll have someone say, whoa, hold on, wait. Well, how did he miss? I just 5 rounds ago, because that's a pain point for Jeff. He missed with his spell. Whoa, no, you said the DC was 12 and he just hit with an 11? And now it's a whole different story. So I think maybe it's even worth having a conversation at some point. I don't know. That's a whole nother can of worms. But if you are going to fudge rolls and that's important to the players, it may be worth a conversation of like, hey, do you got, I don't know. Maybe not. But I just don't know that that's, I would not want my players fudging rolls, I guess is the thing.
Yeah. So I guess for me, and I'm not trying to like psychoanalyze any specific people and, try to get into why you specifically might do this or that. But for me, at least, the way that it feels to me, and this is not necessarily how everyone's going to see or think about it themselves, and that's okay. For me, it kind of feels like a point of arrogance. Like, I know what's best for the story, and what I say is going to be better than what anybody else would say. Of like, you made this roll and you made this decision, and this should be the result, but it's going to be better if we do it my way. Like, I don't feel necessarily comfortable making that call all the time as the GM. And you do have to ask the question honestly, why is it fair for the GM and not the players? Is there any reason? If the point is that you can make a decision that'll make the story better by ignoring the rules, why is that only your purview as the GM? If I, as the player, say, it'll be way better if I hit this attack. It'll be way more exciting if I do. Why? And the story will be better. The pacing will be snappier. It'll be more intense. It'll be more dramatic. It'll be more triumphant. Like, you have to be able to answer, why is it right for you and not for them to do that? And yeah, I personally, it's difficult for me to come to that conclusion of like, no, my story is the best story. And maybe I'm coloring it the wrong way. And I know plenty of people probably fudge and don't think of it that way. But for me, that's the way that it can come across, is like, you could just take the failure and make an interesting story out of the failure. If somebody rolls to hit and they miss and then they die, that can be an amazing story of how they almost did it. And now you've lost this party member. What are you even going to do? How do you mourn them? How do you continue this journey on now that they're gone? Like, there's so many interesting things to unpack as a result of that sort of failure, of letting the player die. And you might take away amazing story moments of like, I'll give an example of there was a campaign I played in once that was like a Middle Earth campaign, a Lord of the Rings game. And somebody ended up dying in a combat, and the GM could have very easily fudged it so that they didn't die. The orc rolls to hit you. He got an 18 on the die and has a +7, but he missed. Oh, dang it, he almost had you. But when that person died, we had a funeral scene the next session. It was the best moment of the campaign. If everyone gave these like rousing like speeches and these conversations and these like deep player to player interactions of like, I had this story that we were going on with this person. How are we going to go on? What do we do? Like, was it my fault? Like all these amazing conversations and all these amazing moments. If the GM fudged that role, we would not have had any of that. So like there's a point as to which, you know, is the story more streamlined and more predictable for you as the GM if you fudge those things? Yes. Is it better? I think it's not obvious what the answer to that is all the time. Maybe it would be better, but maybe it wouldn't be better. But by deciding to fudge the role, you've said that you get to make that call and not anybody else, which I think is not necessarily fair to everybody else.
Yeah, you had me thinking the same thing. Whatever it was that you said, I feel like sparked something very similar in that sense, where it immediately occurred to me, what gives you the right? No, but seriously, that idea that the GM can do it and it's kind of very accepted. But I think that is one of the most important things, Jeff, is I love a good story where you fail at the end. If it wasn't because, you know, again, if you didn't make one bad roll and fall down a pit, right? So for me, the reason I don't feel like I should fudge rolls is because if I have to fudge a roll, it's because I messed up. And like I said, I mean, I said as much, but that's the idea. That's what I was finding is sometimes I would run my combats in a way that I would like inefficiently spread out the damage so that people didn't die. Like when I was starting out, because I was afraid that somebody would feel, why are you targeting me? Nobody's ever asked me, why are you targeting me? And if they did, if I really take that far enough, I think, well, because you're the one that's doing the most damage. They realize that, you know, if it's an intelligent person or creature, I'm like, I don't know what to tell you. They're going after you. You know what I mean? Stop putting on so much damage, run away. I don't know. But I would feel so bad that if a player died or got hurt, they weren't having fun. But in direct contrast, as a player, I'm having the most fun when I'm almost dying or when I'm dying. When I first saw it, I was quite young. I don't know the year it came out. But when I first saw the Two Towers, I walked out of it and I hated it. I was so mad. Now, I was a kid at this point. I mean, I was like, I don't know, 10 or 12, say. So give me a little grace here. But I remember being so sad for a little while. And then whether I was talking to somebody or something happened, I feel like somebody must have told me this. I said, oh, well, why did this happen and this? And it was like, nothing good happened in the whole movie. Like I was saying, like, no good happened. Great stuff obviously happened. And somebody said, well, yeah, but what would the third movie be about if they succeeded at everything they tried to do in the second movie? And I was like, oh, you know what I mean? Like it totally, and at 12, it changed my whole worldview where I'm like, oh, sometimes you have to go down here to end up back up here. And I think that's so important. So like I said, for me, that's where it comes to fudging, where I feel that it undermines the whole thing because you have to draw the line somewhere, and deciding where that line is so murky. But if I do my job right, I don't have to fudge rolls because nobody's falling into pits and almost dying. And I go, oh, well, there's a pillowy landing down there because I messed up, you know?
Yeah, and I think to sort of wrap it up, the whole question we started with was what roles are fun to fail and what roles aren't fun to fail. And I think that for me, it's important to remember what you guys both just hit on, which is this. If there wasn't failure, there wouldn't be a story. And that conflict and narrative comes from failing and then figuring out how you deal with that failure. And so I think we've covered a lot of ground in this, but I think the thing that I want to end it on for me, and like my sentiment is to echo kind of, James, what you're saying. And I don't remember who said that to you, but was it me? About the Two Towers?
Honestly, I have no clue. Somebody did. Okay. I'm like, I'm almost certain I didn't land on that myself at such a young age. Yeah. It may well have been you.
I think it was the car ride home, and you were like, oh, I hated that. And that's, yeah. I believe I remember that story, and I'll cop to the fact that I forgot that it was you who I said it to. I just remembered I peripherally assigned it to someone in the family. But when I tell that story, so now it's funny that we linked it back together. But my point was that the failure is the part that brings us, as you say, down here so that we can figure out what story we want to tell to get back up here. And sometimes the most painful but memorable stories, the one like the Middle-earth campaign, is where you get down here and you can't make it back up. But sometimes the most intriguing, interesting story that sticks with you is the player that still tries. And how does everyone else respond when that happens? And so I guess just thinking of it that way in terms of what roles are fun to fail and what roles aren't. And it's kind of like, you know what? If we think of it the right way, they can all be fun to fail. It's more about how we react and how we respond and what we do with it than it is about when we fail and how we fail, if that makes sense. So I think that'll be kind of my closing.
Yeah, something that I didn't necessarily think of beforehand that I'm really pleased kind of came out sort of accidentally in all this conversation is most of the things that we talked about were how you describe the role failing rather than whether or not they failed. So you didn't fail because you looked like an idiot. You failed because you did it great, but there was an unexpected thing. You failed the spell not because you tried to cast the spell and it just vaporized for no reason, but because the enemy overcame it and challenged you dramatically. That there's ways that you can sort of flavor success and failure by the descriptions of what happens that can make them more exciting. And some roles are just, flat out going to be, anticlimactic if there's failure, And again, to what James said, that's just something to take in as a GM of like, maybe I just shouldn't have had a role there. If failure was going to be so uninteresting, then maybe that was my mistake as a GM to have that role. But yeah, so much of it ended up kind of being about what you do with the failure as the GM and as the player. Again, I think it all comes back, for me, to tension and drama and that sort of narrative twist of like, what is this going to do to the story? How is this going to make the characters change or have to fight to overcome things? And those failures that have the most challenge, that have the most drama, those are the things that we remember and that we enjoy. I think it's the failures that are of no consequence that are almost the ones that end up being the worst. So yeah, I'll kind of leave my piece there.
I agree that talking about this helped me somewhat discover some of those nuances, that idea that it is just about that expectation, or that the failure isn't the thing that bothers me, as a player or a GM. And so, yeah, overall, I think that we touched on a lot of really good stuff, and it took me a long time. Like I used to save scum in XCOM all the time. Like again, quite young, but there's something that's so much more interesting to win a mission with 5 of your, 10 people dying. When you're like, oh, one of those was my good one. Like to me, that immediately spawned, nope, gotta load it. My best guy died. And I'm like, no, the time that I really was like, okay, well, my best guy died. What happens now? I'm playing a single player game. Nobody else is here. There's some story, but this guy was completely unique to me. And it made me feel like, oh, what am I going to do without this? This guy's going to take his spot. Okay, well, I don't have another one. Like, it made me feel things, and that really changed the way both that I play video games and colors RPGs. And especially, it's important to fail sometimes. So especially with fudging, keep that in mind, as well as sometimes you don't need to call for a roll, and just make sure that when you do, it's at least interesting to the story, because otherwise, what's the point?
Yeah. And I think that that's a great place to end it. We're Tabletop Terrors, and, we love fun, creativity, and, of course, tabletop RPGs. What about you? Do you like failure? Do you hate failure? I would love to hear this, especially about the fudging. Do you keep your fudge for the sweet shops? And if not, why don't you keep your fudge for the sweet shops? Sweet shops, not sweatshops. The The channel comes out with new videos every Sunday and Thursday, and if you want to be notified when that happens, hit the notification bell. And I guess we'll end it with a toast.
May you mend the first break.
May you kill the first snake.
May you conquer everything you undertake. There was a campaign that I played in where the GM used critical hit charts. So if you roll a critical hit, you can have some really brutal, violent effects happen. And some of them got really nasty, up into including instant death. And we had been playing this campaign for many, many sessions. I think we were on like session 18 to 20. You know, we had been playing for months. We had kind of built up to this penultimate part of the story where we were going to the final confrontation. And on the way to the final battle, we see an enemy ship. I'm the captain of this crew in this scenario as the player. I decide to go take down this enemy ship. We can get them before we get to the battle. It'll make our lives easier. The very first round of combat, before I've even taken a turn, one of the enemies runs up to me, critical hits me, rolls an effect that kills my character outright, and I die on the spot. And I'm the captain of this ship. And immediately the crew dissolves as a result of this. The entire crew disbands, the final fight doesn't happen. But it was one of the most dramatic endings to the campaign that I've ever had because of how surprising and shocking it was to the group. And I would never change a thing, even if in the moment it was so shocking to me.